About it, but that is not where we begin this morning. We have huge breaking news, and for that, let us bring in our basketball guys. Jay Will is here to analyze, but Adrian Wojnarowski, the man himself, has an enormous story that I think has implications for the moment and extending all the way to next summer. Woj, the stage is yours.
Greeny, Bradley Beal, the all-star guard in Washington, has agreed to a 2-year, $72 million max contract extension. His agent, Mark Bartelstein, tells me this morning that keeps him under contract with a player option in 2022-2023. That keeps him now under contract and out of free agency for the next 3 years. It is a remarkable commitment from Beal to an organization that is in a downturn now. Ted Leonsis, their owner, Tommy Shepard, their new GM, sold Beal in these last few months on a future in Washington, and he can opt out of his deal in 3 years, and if he re-signs in Washington, could sign the biggest deal in league history, 5 years, $266 million. But the ripple effects are felt all over the league because this was a player who contenders, there's not a team in the league who didn't want to get involved in a Bradley Beal trade scenario. Now he is. That conversation will not happen. He is committed to Washington, and this is a great day for the Wizards.
No question about it. So there's so much to unpack in this story. Let's briefly start there. We are living in a time where star players are forcing their way out of good teams, much less teams that are struggling. So this is quite a statement that Bradley Beal is making about Washington.
It's a massive statement for the Wizards and Tommy Shepard. So my thing is, in an age where Kevin Durant leaves Golden State, you have Kawhi that leaves Toronto after winning a championship. Now you're having Bradley Beal say, I want to stay here in D.C. And actually, he didn't counter at all throughout the course of the year. He said, this is going to be a year of patience. I have to reevaluate all my decisions, but I want to be here. That says huge statement for the Washington Wizards.
Look, I mean, we're at a time where football players are forcing their way out of teams they don't want to be on anymore. So Bradley Beal makes the huge commitment to stay in Washington. They'll rebuild around him. In the meantime, let's put some names to the teams that you think are very disappointed this morning, Woj. Who is it out there that thought they were very much in contention to get Bradley Beal and thought he was the missing piece for a championship?
Well, certainly the Miami Heat have been a team that would have loved to have gotten him. The Lakers, teams like the Clippers, the Brooklyn Nets, the Boston Celtics, anybody who has assets, eventually would have tried to get involved in Washington with Bradley Beal. Teams have been calling for months. When Tommy Shepard took over this team in July as GM from the interim job, this was something no one saw coming. The feeling around the league was eventually Beal would push his way out like a lot of other players had. But Mark Bartelstein told me this morning, from the very beginning, Bradley Beal told him, I want to make it work in Washington. And Bartelstein, Beal, Ted Leonsis, Tommy Shepard, multiple meetings over the last few months, and Leonsis, Shepard sold him on a vision of rebooting this organization. Remember, they still have John Wall on a massive contract. He is probably going to miss this whole season, but there's some young pieces there, Thomas Bryant, who they will start to try to reshape this roster around. So
let's just think this through for a moment here. There are no huge free agents that we expect to be available next summer. Take the name Anthony Davis out of that. He's not going anywhere. He's staying in L.A. So this was the big fish that everyone was waiting for, and now he is no longer available for other teams. So this, I think, really does reshape a lot of people's plans right now.
Think about the best backcourts in the NBA. When you think about Steph and Clay when Clay comes back, Dame, CJ, you will put John Wall and Bradley Beal in that conversation when John Wall comes back. The East is open, guys. I mean, Milwaukee's good. They're the same team as they were last year, minus Malcolm Brogdon. They still have some good pieces. You think about, what's happening in Toronto. They're kind of on a downturn. Philadelphia, it could be an implosion year for them if they don't win the whole thing. It could be open for Washington to regroup and regather.
And just very quickly, and math has never been my strong suit, but when you and I were briefly catching up on this before we came out here, you mentioned the extension he could sign if he gets to his 10th year would be 5 years.
$260.
$260?
Oh.
$266 million. That would be the biggest deal in league history. If he left, went somewhere else, 4 years, about $200 million.
I would stay too.
I'm proud to tell you I didn't need to use a pencil to figure out that's $53 million and change per year.
That would be the biggest contract.
It would be the biggest ever.
Yes. Jay, Will, $53 million a year for a basketball player. I don't even know what to say. Anyway, that is enormous news this morning. Outstanding work as always. Woj, dropping the news as we begin our show today. Bradley Beal staying in Washington. The long faces are in the front offices of a lot of other teams around the NBA. More on that as we go. Meanwhile, it has been an up and down season so far for Patrick Mahomes. Through 3 weeks, he led the NFL with almost 1,200 passing yards, 10 touchdowns, no interceptions. Typical Mahomes. Chiefs won all those games and then won again in Week 4, despite Mahomes being held without a touchdown. Then in Week 5, they lose to the Colts. He re-aggravates a left ankle injury that he'd originally suffered in the season opener against the Jaguars and clearly does not look himself. He was able to play the following week in the showdown game against Deshaun and the Texans, but Kansas City suffered its second straight home loss after starting 4-0, and Mahomes did throw his first interception of the season. And so there is this sort of feeling out there across the NFL that there's a blueprint now for how to beat the Kansas City Chiefs, who will start the NFL weekend tonight, as mentioned, at Denver in a divisional game. So, D. Wood, right now, I never would have thought I'd hear myself say this, but does this feel like a very important game for Kansas City on the road?
Absolutely. You've lost 2 straight home games, and now you're coming up against a divisional opponent in Denver Broncos who's also won 2 games. So the Kansas City Chiefs, their defense, they can't stop the run at all. They're 30th in rush defense. Phillip Lindsay is getting back on track. So, and the Denver Broncos defense is playing pretty good football. So this is a game that everyone needs to watch for.
Yeah, to me, the Broncos smell blood in the water. And Greeny, in football, a lot of it is, do we even have the talent to beat this team? Teams go into games against the Chiefs realizing, man, we ain't got it. We ain't got what it takes. If I'm the Broncos and any other team, you're seeing the Chiefs have lost 2 straight games. I smell blood in the water. Now's the time to attack.
You know, I think that there was a feeling coming into this season that the AFC was a 2-horse race, that it was New England, it was Kansas City, and everyone else was trying to figure out where they fit into that. Patriots have held up their end of the bargain. Are the Chiefs that team right now? Are the Chiefs on a level with the Patriots, or are they closer to everybody else?
I think I'm not ready to write the Chiefs off just yet. I think when they are healthy, I still have the Chiefs right there with the Patriots.
My problem is that's such a big if. You know, you can't recover from an injury midseason. Most of all players are to some degree hurt, but it matters when it's your quarterback. Greeny, when it's Patrick Mahomes, he started off the season, I believe, 11 touchdowns through 4 games, something along those lines. He has 4 touchdowns in the last 3. He's ailing, and the Chiefs go as Pat Mahomes goes.
And even take that out of the equation. Look at the lay of the land. The last 2 weeks did significant damage. Those were home losses to teams that they could face in the playoffs, in Indianapolis and Houston, that they could conceivably be in a situation where they're in a tiebreaker and one of them gets the 2 seed and a bye, and the Chiefs have to take the 3 seed and a wild card game. So those are 2 bad losses that are going to stick regardless of how healthy he is.
That is our NFL insider extraordinaire, Dan Graziano, and I want to spin this to the other important piece of this game tonight. If the Chiefs lose, then everything feels up for grabs. If the Broncos lose, which I think is the more expected outcome here, Denver then falls to 2-5, and we will be about a week and a half away from the NFL trade deadline, and the name Von Miller, superstar pass rusher, will start to be spoken very loudly in league circles.
There are a couple people on Denver's roster that teams have an eye on for trade acquisitions, but obviously the biggest one would be Von Miller. It's a very interesting situation. Denver is telling teams at this point he is not available, but you mentioned we're still 12 days away. 3-4 days ago, Jacksonville was telling teams Jalen Ramsey wasn't available. Now he's on the Rams. So things do change. Von Miller, 2 years left on his contract, but they're both team option years. It's $17.5 million each season, and it's a contract that people could take on. He's a 30-year-old pass rusher who had 14.5 sacks last year, still productive, reasonably priced.
He's 30 years old.
Yes.
Jalen Ramsey just went for 2 number 1s. He's a lot younger. What is the price tag would you expect on a trade for Von Miller?
Trying to get a gauge of this, talking to people around the league, I think they could get a first-round pick and possibly more for Von Miller based on the fact that pass rushers don't become available very often, and there's a lot of teams that need them. Last year at the deadline, Dante Fowler got traded from Jacksonville to the Rams for a 3rd-round pick and a 5th-round pick. This is a guy the Jaguars were done with. I mean, it was a low-end acquisition for the Rams, taking a flyer on a guy. Von Miller, an established guy who could impact this year's playoff race.
You look skeptical.
Yeah, I don't see it for 2 reasons. Number one, I don't see Von Miller getting a first, not because he's not worth the talent. Like you said, 14.5 sacks last season. He's still a bad man. But to trade a first-round pick who could be the next Von Miller and not the next because Von Miller's a Hall of Famer, that doesn't make sense. But secondly, Greeny, Von Miller isn't really the issue or the pass rush or the lack thereof. If Denver's 22-32 since they won the Super Bowl. They have so many problems that one pick or two picks can't address. They have some foundational issues.
See, I disagree because I think if a team that's on that perennial team that's vying for the Super Bowl, who usually picks at the bottom of the first round, why not go after Von Miller? Those type of guys, like you said, pass rushers don't free up often, so he could be a critical piece for a team.
It's interesting. You mentioned Dante Fowler, who felt like they were just giving him away last year. He played a huge role in the Rams making a run to the Super Bowl. Von Miller should definitely be able to do that. Now, I mentioned we're 2 weeks or so from the trade deadline. There are other big names here. Dan Graziano, let's look at some of them. A.J. Green, what are we hearing?
Well, this is the final year of his contract in Cincinnati. Hasn't played yet this year, and obviously the Bengals season is going nowhere at 0-6. So teams have been calling to see if he's available. Again, Cincinnati is telling them no, but things do change as the deadline gets closer and the offers get better. A lot of teams out there looking for a receiver, most prominently the New England Patriots, and if they're involved, a lot of other teams are going to be involved.
Imagine A.J. Green on the Patriots, or maybe this guy. How about Stephon Diggs in Minnesota?
Weird situation here because they're 4-2. They're not in a mode where they're going to be dumping their good players, and his contract is team favorable, but there's been some issues with him the last couple of weeks. He missed a practice. He's had some issues with some things that have been going on there. There's some chatter that maybe he doesn't love that contract he signed last summer. So it's possible, especially if they start losing a couple games here, they could look to maybe make a move that just sort of shakes things up. But they would want another asset in return that could help them this year.
Well, let's look at his season, okay? So through the first 3 games this year, Diggs had just 6 catches and 1 touchdown. But in the last 3 games, he's been completely rejuvenated. You look at the numbers. He's had more catches than he did targets. He's been spectacular and caught 3 touchdowns last week. Stephon Diggs, it feels to me, is a guy that I'm Minnesota. Why would I even be considering this? I think they look like a team that if they get things right, could make a deep run this year.
Imagine, like, that get-back game against the New York Giants did wonders for Kirk Cousins because now he goes on and completely thrashes the Philadelphia Eagles, last week. So, if I'm Minnesota right now, I should be feeling pretty good about what Kirk Cousins is doing and how he responded to the criticism that he got from his receivers.
Yeah, Diggs ain't going nowhere. I mean, they honestly, Minnesota, they punked Diggs in the first place when he tried to voice his displeasure, and then they fined him, and then he played, and he was like, you know what, I'm happy here. He already got punked. He's not going anywhere, and nor should he, because he balled last week, and he is a flat-out stud.
Well, you were there last week, Graziano. What were people saying?
Look, it's a little bit of a fragile situation. Had they lost that game to the Eagles, I think things would look a lot different. So think about if they lose to Detroit this week, things could start to look different. The whole division is 500 or better. They know it's going to be tough. They've already lost to the Packers and the Bears. It looks good right now. Beat up on the Giants and beat up on the Eagles defense, but it's not 100% solid.
Another big division game for them this week against Detroit. Our next stop is Cleveland. One of the biggest stories, of course, across the sport this year has been the regression of Baker Mayfield. Through 6 games, he leads the league with 11 picks. His QBR is under 40. The Browns are 2-4. They're on their bye week. Yesterday, their general manager, John.
I love everything about him. That hasn't changed for me one bit in terms of his competitiveness, his ability to throw the football and move his thing. What I really like is his teammates like him. I like his approach to the game of football. I like the game planning processes of that. I like how he goes out there and competes. I like his grit that he shows. I like how he throws the football. I like how he extends plays. And, again, last I looked, it takes 53 guys to put this thing together, and it's got to be 53 guys playing the game of football.
Just fascinating that here we are. We sit 6 weeks into this season with all these expectations, and after the rookie year he had last year, and the GM has to sit up there and give a voice of support, if you will, a vote of confidence for the young quarterback. But they're in their bye. We know who they play next. That's New England. Where do you think we sit right now with these Browns?
I still think the Browns are in trouble because they have a couple of issues that I don't think they'll be able to solve even after the bye. The offensive line stinks. They don't play well. And the quarterback turns the ball over a ton. Okay? So those 2 things are going to take time. But I think the Cleveland Browns have a bigger issue. It is just hard to change a culture when you've been losing for so long. Everyone was quick to anoint the Cleveland Browns as a team that's arrived. But remember, Freddie Kitchens is a guy who was a position coach, who just last season was a position coach. Now he's a head coach with one of the youngest teams in the National Football League. There are a lot of things that the Cleveland Browns have to work out.
Yeah, Woody, you hit it on the head. Winning is a muscle, Greeny, that has to be trained. You can't just acquire massive talent and assume that winning will be a byproduct. Winning's a muscle that has to be trained. But furthermore, the Browns had 6 months to fix these issues. These issues won't be fixed in 6 days. You can't fix the offensive line woes, and the offense just does not click. You have all this star-studded players. The offense just doesn't click. Thankfully, that division is not that good, so they're still in the race because they could be all the way out of it.
When teams hire coaches every January, right, they look at this, who the hot coordinator is coming in. Is it going to be an offense guy, a defense guy? Very rarely do you see a team hire this guy's going to come in and change our culture, right? Andy Reid gets let go in Philadelphia. 2 days later, he's coaching the Chiefs. Look how that works out. The Browns believed and believe that Freddie Kitchens can be that kind of guy, but he hasn't proven it. He's never done it before. So you have a quarterback that's never done it before, a coach that's never done it before, and it starts there. Talking to people in that organization, they're all saying the same thing. We need more consistency. We need the roller coaster ride to stop. We need more from our guys. They still believe it's a group that can contend and win, but it's one that hasn't proven that yet.
I'll just keep saying it. Think how different the conversation would be all week long if the Ravens were 5-1.
Yep.
Or if Ben didn't get hurt and the Steelers were 5-1.
Right.
The fact that the division has not run away from them,
Right.
I think, has kept things at a low boil, at a simmer, if
and
you will.
they beat the Ravens. So
and they beat Baltimore in that huge, again, that I called franchise renewing or whatever it was. Whatever it was, I was obviously as wrong as a person could be. Next up is the NFL owners' meetings, where the commissioner, Roger Goodell, revealed yesterday at the conclusion of the meetings that a 17-game regular season is part of the conversations about a new CBA. He didn't go into a lot of details, but there's a lot to talk about.
We've had very fruitful discussions on it, discussing the positives and negatives, the changes to the game that we've made over the last 10 years, which I think are really important as it relates to the safety of the game and how we're preparing and practicing and training our players. And I think those changes have made a significant impact in a positive way. And so that is something that we'll continue to discuss, and it may or may not be part of whatever we ultimately decide.
Okay, so this to me is fascinating. Dan, I want to start with you from the information piece of this, because this is a somewhat precarious time in these conversations, and this is a big deal. Yeah,
we've reached the point where it's kind of an important, critical time for these CBA negotiations, if they are to get done during the season, which is the hope from both sides. Now we know, we've known for a while, the owners are pushing for an expanded season, a 17-game season. The questions remain, how would that work? The owners haven't figured that out yet. There isn't a proposal that would be like, oh, this is exactly how it would work. There's discussions, right? You have your bye leading into the Thursday game, season goes to mid-February, et cetera. They also haven't figured out, more importantly, how much it's going to cost them in terms of what they have to give the players to agree to it. The players want a larger share of the revenue pie in exchange for exposing their bodies to this 17th game, and at this point, those numbers have not matched up.
D. Wood, you played how many years?
12.
Are you in favor of the idea of adding a regular season game?
Hate it. I hate it. I'm more of a traditionalist type of guy. And I just go back to what Mark Cuban had said about the NFL before. He said that pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered. And what he means by that, it just seems like NFL is a beautiful game as it is. It's the #1 sport in this country. And it seems like the NFL just keeps tinkering and keeps doing these things. Well, you don't really need to mess up the golden goose in this particular situation. For me, this has nothing to do with player safety, because we all know that players, you throw enough money at them, they'll go the extra mile. I just don't like the NFL keep tinkering when something is still good.
D-Wood, to your point, if it's not broke, don't fix it. If it's not broke, don't fix it. The NFL, the 16-game regular season, it's not broke, so there's no point in trying to adjust it as it stands. And then, as you also said, players right around week 11 and week 12, fans don't realize this, but players are human. They're sitting at their locker green and they're like, man, how many more games we got left? As soon as you start to add more games, the product will become watered down and each game will mean less and the product will not be as good. There's just no point in trying to do it.
Look, there have been 20 weeks on the NFL schedule, one way or another, for a very long time. There used to be 6 preseason games and 14 regular season games. They changed that in the late 70s. This would probably mean removing an exhibition game and all the rest of that. Dan, how would you assess the likelihood this gets done?
I think there's a strong likelihood, but it's important for people to understand that the owners are not 32 united minds on this. And there are owners that would rather keep it the way it is and not have to give back all that money to the players. And so they have to figure all that out for themselves before they get back to the bargaining table.
Possibility of a 17th game. Maybe there's one that they move all over the place. Very interesting stuff. We are very busy, as you can tell, on this Thursday morning with our breaking news and much more. Coming up, Sunday's marquee NFL game, Dak against Carson. Which quarterback would you take? We had a spirited discussion yesterday. We'll see what these guys think today. And we cannot take our eyes off Zion.